I'm really glad to be able to be here tonight. Thank you for making some time for me, for us, to update you on the work of our climate action plan. Colt Vaughan, whose picture you see there in a second, is going to kind of take us through the presentation around the bulk of the work. I'll just say that it has been a lot of work. It's been a process that I don't think any of us who have been working at it primarily would have anticipated the bulk of. It's a little bit like peeling an onion apart, and you come to another layer, and you come to another layer, and you come to another layer. And it's largely a new kind of work that's happening not just here, but around the world. And so there's a lot that's just ongoing and that will continue to go on for some time. So I think whenever Colt is up and running here, I'll just turn it over to him, and then I will be glad to take any questions or enter into any discussion after we see this. And also just to point out the handout that we distributed just this evening here, which will help you, I think, to follow along here. So Colt, if you are ready.
Sure. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Mayor Stutzman, and also to the council for having me today. Can you all hear me okay? Can I just get someone to give me a thumbs up, maybe?
Oh, we can hear you fine.
Okay, good deal. So first, I'm going to offer a little bit of background information, just to refresh your memory about how this process works. And then we'll move into what a climate action plan is. And then we'll get into the inventory that we've completed for 2019. And then we'll circle around to the strategies that we're using to reduce emissions in Goshen. So some of you have probably already seen this, but just as a refresher, in early 2019, Mayor Stutzman formed the MEAC, short for the Mayor's Environmental Advisory Committee. Simultaneously, he worked with this council to pass Resolution 2019-19. That resolution states that Goshen will create and implement a climate action plan by 2021 with the goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2035. Then over the course of that summer, the city researched and later published Goshen's first ever emissions inventory. Then later that year, the Department of Environmental Resilience was created with the immediate task of pioneering that resolution. So as a result, our department has been working toward that end, and we are here today to update you on what we've been working on this year and where we are headed this fall. So our department is working on researching and developing a climate action plan. As a reminder, climate action plans, or CAPs as they're sometimes referred to, are strategic planning documents often completed at the local level to account for differences in local geography, climate, culture, feasibility, and so on. The primary goal of this plan is to reduce emissions and generate cost savings through efficiency. Furthermore, this plan focuses on local government operations only. And we are not alone. Many municipalities across the US are committed to climate action planning. The latest estimate I saw indicated that nearly 300 cities across the US are working on these issues. However, in this map, the dark blue shows which municipalities across the state are working on climate action. And the specific cities are listed to the right. These leaders in climate action are home to more than 2 million Hoosiers. So our first task in developing this document was to measure emissions across government operations for 2019. These are our results. First, let me point out that sometimes you may see CO2e as opposed to just CO2. This means all types of greenhouse gases are just converted into the equivalent of CO2, which is where the E comes from, is that equivalent. This simply means the gases are just standardized in terms of warming potential for simplicity. I may use them interchangeably, but for all intents and purposes, CO2e can be thought of as CO2 and vice versa. Okay, so this bar graph shows the total CO2 emissions for Goshen's 2019 government operations. The colors represent different origins for emissions. So the purple category represents the emissions associated with water and wastewater treatment operations. The green represents emissions from employees commuting to and from work. The bright orange represents emissions from city-owned vehicles, and that's this, let me see if I have that's this category here. So those are city-owned vehicles, including cars, trucks, mowers, etc. The lighter orange color represents emissions from electricity consumption used to power streetlights and traffic signals. It only comprises 1% of the total. And then finally, the yellow category represents the emissions from electricity consumption for generally powering all other buildings and facilities in government operations. As you can see, emissions for 2019 totaled nearly 10,000 metric tons of CO2. And most of those are coming from water and wastewater treatment. So as I mentioned, this inventory is really the first critical step in reducing emissions because we have to know where we're at before we can move forward. So the next step then is to forecast these emissions out to 2035 so that we can understand how we can achieve net zero emissions by 2035. So this is what we've done in this image. So this graph depicts those same categories as the previous bar graph. So for example, the yellow is still the emissions for buildings and facilities. One addition that you will notice is the two dashed lines. The red line represents reducing emissions by 50% by 2028. While this is a useful measurement tool, it's not a formally adopted goal. It just helps us to understand how we get to net zero by 2035. And that's what that second green line represents, which is very difficult to see because it runs from it runs along the zero axis from left to right. But essentially that is where the zero net emissions by 2035 would occur. Now the major difference from the last graph is that we have used standard scientific methods of forecasting to assess what Goshen's emissions might look like in 2035. So this graph simply presents projected CO2 emissions by category and in total, all the way up to the very top of the line. We call this the business as usual projection because it assumes that the city takes no action to curb emissions and that population is growing at a normal rate. Thus, the first thing you're likely to notice is that emissions actually decrease until 2028. Which puts us precisely on track to meet our 50% reduction goal. So probably a natural question is, where does that reduction in emissions come from? Well, NIPSCO, the Northern Indiana Public Service Company, supplies most of the city's electricity. So in similar faith to Goshen, they are committed to reducing their emissions as well. So they are reducing coal as a source of energy supply and are shifting towards cheaper and greener energy sources, such as natural gas and wind power, for example. This means that NIPSCO alone helps Goshen to achieve its midpoint goal. That's, that sort of tracking metric. However, NIPSCO does not have any plans beyond 2028 to reduce its emissions. Thus, the city of Goshen will need to begin planning now to help bring those emissions down by 2035. So how does Goshen's expected emissions compare to global emissions projections? Well, this graph presents global CO2 emissions projected into the future. The projections are estimated in a global scientific review process through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. First, the blue category shows historical emissions. Then two projections are shown. So the yellow shows the amount of CO2 emissions that would occur if we continued on with business as usual. However, the purple area shows CO2 emissions that should occur if global pledges and targets are met. This purple projection demonstrates a rather phenomenal shift in climate action. It means that governments and corporations all over the world are working to reduce emissions and curb climate change. Governments just like Goshen and businesses just like NIPSCO. In my opinion, this is Goshen representing global leadership, and that is why our work is important. It's because Goshen is doing its part to deter a global crisis. Okay, so let's take a turn back to Goshen's projections. as I mentioned earlier, NIPSCO is helping the government to meet that midpoint goal of reducing emissions by 50% by 2028. However, the benefits of them switching to less carbon-intensive power runs out later that year. This means that we don't yet have the capacity to achieve zero emissions by 2035. However, there's still plenty of room for work to be done to achieve that goal. So this graph is slightly different, and I'll explain how. The blue line that you see represents that original business as usual projection. That means Goshen takes no further action. However, the new white space below it represents action that we actually take from strategies that we have researched. So our department is working to continue finding ways to reduce emissions in a manner that achieves or exceeds the goal. So today, we're really here to present some of our strategies that are helping us to achieve these reductions. For example, some of the strategies included in the reductions observed in this graph are accomplished by planting and accounting for trees, diverting waste, switching to electric vehicles, reducing fertilizers and mower use, increasing the efficiency of the wastewater treatment plant, and retrofitting streetlights with LED bulbs. But let's dive into two strategies included in this projection as well. So these strategies are active transportation and building efficiency. The first strategy we will look at is building efficiency standards and techniques, as we're calling it. This involves increasing efficiency in lighting and windows and adding smart thermostats, fans, sensors, and things along those lines to government facilities. First, however, this program is designed to audit each government's buildings and facility for energy inefficiencies. And then it will create a plan for implementing improvements. Preliminary research indicates that we can expect to reduce energy consumption by 30%, and we will aim to do this by 2030. This 30% reduction in energy consumption will save approximately $100,000 per year. And it will help reduce Goshen's total emissions by 4% per year. So a second strategy we will look at is the active transportation. Currently, employees commute to work and back home, plus work-related travel, comprises 18% of all municipal emissions. Therefore, this strategy proposes options for reducing travel-related emissions 25% by 2030. Among the suggested actions for achieving this 25% reduction goal are promoting employee bicycle commute to work and encouragement of worksite to worksite bike commute when appropriate. The first direct action then would be to identify and minimize obstacles and barriers to biking to, from, and at work. The second direct action would be to develop internal guidance to allow and encourage bicycling as a commuting option during the day. The third direct action would be to actually provide bicycles for daily trips for city employees when appropriate as a cost savings approach to reduce emissions. So initial costs of purchasing bikes could be as high as $5,000 with annual maintenance thereafter around $2,000. However, the benefits of this strategy are difficult to quantify, but we know that each mile traveled for a bike is cheaper than each mile traveled for a vehicle when accounting for fuel and maintenance costs, for example. Plus, secondary benefits from such programs would also likely enhance employees' quality of life and improve health. So at this point, I hope what we've demonstrated with these two strategies is how we are attempting to reduce emissions in Goshen to get us to our goal. But these are only two of more than 45 different strategies that we're considering. All of the strategies remain sensitive to cost, and we are looking to maximize Goshen's return on investment for each one. Clearly, there's more work to be done, not only this year, but every year after, between now and 2035 and thereafter. So this plan will first focus on breadth. Then it will focus on the depth. What I mean by that is our department is currently identifying ways to reduce emissions in broad categorical manners. That is what our climate action plan will reflect. However, in the future, to achieve these goals, more research in detail will need to occur to actually achieve them. That is how the imminent climate action plan lays out a roadmap to help us achieve the goals. So finally, I'll just say this and then I'll turn it back over to Aaron. We all have to do our part. And I'm really proud of Goshen for taking these initial steps to leave a better world for its children and for its community. And now I'll turn it back over. Thank you.
Thank you, Colt. And I should have, I apologize for not reintroducing Colt before we started. Colt Vaughan is an IU grad student at the O'Neill School of Environmental and Public Policy. And he has been working with us here since May, the end of May, through the Indiana Sustainability Development Program, funded through IU. As an extern, there are other externs throughout the state working in this capacity too. And in fact, there's so much work to do that that more money has been made available from IU so that Colt is able to stay on into the fall here through October. And I think we may shake a little more money loose, or we're planning to shake a little more money loose to keep him here through November yet. Again, as a reflection of the scale of the work that is in front of us. Colt mentioned the 45 plus strategies that we are working with. We've completed an employee survey to help us think about what these strategies ought to be. We have had 3 focus groups of city employees, some of whom are represented here, to help us think about what these strategies ought to mean. We have been working with the MEAC, the Mayor's Environmental Advisory Committee, again, to vet these strategies and to think through them. We do still have a lot of work to define what these strategies need to be and how they can work, what the benefits are and what the costs are. A further reflection of the scope and the scale of the work is the fact that the IU Environmental Resilience Institute, which has been kind of leading this work throughout the state with the cohort of cities that you saw, has also recognized that the resources available to us are just not quite up to par yet, because this work is so new. And right now they are entering into an agreement with IU and Purdue students to help create the cost benefit analyses that will be necessary for us to help to sift through these strategies and understand what the real value of them is. That's not an excuse, and I think that we are on track to complete an initial draft of this climate action plan by the end of the year. But what it does clearly point to is the fact that when this document is finished and is brought to you for approval, it needs to be understood that this will be a living document that will have to have the capacity to breathe and to grow and to evolve into the future towards 2035 as new technologies become available, as new data collection capacities become available, as we become aware of new data sets that we need to understand and take advantage of. So we are right now here at the outset trying to understand what it is that it means for us to attempt a climate action plan and to take responsibility for the emissions that we are creating, and also capture the savings and the efficiencies that can come to us by doing so. Starting now will make this work much easier for those who enter into the work 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15, 20, etc. Because this work will go on for quite a while as we learn to think about the way that we work together in new ways. So with that, I would like to just say that I think this is a really remarkable opportunity that we all have here right now in this room, but also in the broader city of Goshen. Facing into climate change, regardless of how you think about it, is typically an overwhelming kind of prospect. For an individual, it's pretty impossible to think of meaningful action. But here we are as city employees, and our work is showing that there is meaningful action that together we can actually take on behalf of the people that we serve. And that's the reason that I feel excited about this. So I'm glad to take questions about our work to this point, and where we're headed, and whatever discussion needs to happen too at this point.
Aaron, if I could really quickly, I'd just like to thank you and your team, the staff, the volunteers, Colt. We asked
Teresa
you
Saylor.
guys to create something that we didn't even really know what we were asking you to create or how. And I just applaud you for all the hard work and where you're at. I know it was a couple, 3-4 weeks ago when we met at one of our catch-up meetings, where there was a little concern did COVID-19 put too much of a delay in this? And I just applaud you guys for how hard you're working to overcome the time that was missed because we couldn't get together and talk with people. And I think you're doing great work, and really excited to keep working with you to see what we can create. And I love that you talk about this document being a living document, and it's going to continue to change over the next several years as we learn more. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I did have a question. I know that at Goshen schools, we have an environmental department headed up by Judy Miller. Have you spoken to her about some of these things that you're talking about, especially in facilities and how to reduce emissions? Because I know that she's been very effective there, and I don't know if you've got a relationship with her.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, Judy Miller at Goshen Community Schools. I've had various conversations with her over the past couple of years, and she has done some remarkable work there that can be replicated throughout the city, as well as Glenn Gilbert at Goshen College also done some remarkable work there with the facilities. So there are definitely places within our own community where we can look to for advice and practices, effective practices. That's right. And part of what we are seeing as a result of paying attention to some of those examples already is that there is a fairly large amount of what I would call low-hanging fruit, what we're calling low-hanging fruit, available to us. Relatively cheap kinds of solutions, including shades on the interior side of windows, some simple changing of thermostats to smart thermostats, motion sensors to help reduce the way that lights and fans and other things come on. So there is some cost, but that's pretty minimal in the large scheme for the kind of energy reduction that those things provide. Planting trees, as a city forester, I was just reviewing again that the value of our trees, the value that our trees provide, just the trees that are in the public right-of-way, they help us to avoid roughly equivalent the same amount of emissions as our vehicle fleet is putting in to the atmosphere. So it's a roughly 1-to-1 cancellation of those emissions already. So that's a simple solution, and so hence the canopy goal. There certainly will be more difficult reductions that we'll need to consider, especially as we move towards 2035, as we complete the easy things that we'll have to become more and more creative about. and we will hope to be able to take advantage of evolving technologies as well. I don't know that we can count on that, but we can certainly hope for and make plans to work around that as needed too.
Aaron, I just appreciate the energy and enthusiasm you bring to this. It's contagious, and I think it is an exciting undertaking, and I'm glad to have someone who's so enthusiastic about it at the head of it. Thank you.
Well, let me just say that Teresa's and Colt's energy has been extremely contagious for me. They have really done the bulk of the heavy lifting, and I'm trying to steer and manage and understand. There is much of this work which is not in my wheelhouse, and so I've had to drink from the fire hose, and I am just really grateful for them and their abilities.
Well, good. I'm glad you have a good group dynamic going.
Yeah.
If you get a smaller hose, you'll waste less water.
Aaron, I did have a quick question. So
Yeah.
as we know, Colt will be potentially leaving at the end of November. How do you as your team continue to build on the momentum? I know that there are a lot of resources that you mentioned. Just wanted to make sure that, are there things that we as a city council could continue to support this particular department as we support other departments within the city?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, right. Colt unfortunately will not be able to stay with us forever. We haven't talked about that possibility. So we will certainly explore the possibility of another extern through IU for next year to continue this work. It's not immediately clear whether that will be provided for us. We've taken advantage of this program for 2 summers in a row now, 2 years in a row now, and it's not clear whether they will provide that for a 3rd year. But there may be some other options for that kind of extern-intern kind of relationship. We certainly want to explore further relationships with Goshen College and the kinds of work that they are interested in, both academically and professionally there. I think by the end of Colt's stint here, we will be at the point where we can kind of tie an initial bow around the work and kind of step back and see, this is where we are, here comes the next step. And that'll be an important assessment too. But we would be glad to consider any and all kind of involvement from the community, because this is a community process that benefits the community.
Well, thank you, Aaron. We appreciate your work, like I said before, and time, and Colt for joining us tonight for your presentation. So we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
All right, thank you very much. And we also really appreciate your leadership, Mayor. Thank you all.